Hey guys, I am signed in right now to Mastering. And one of the things that I want to show you with Mastering is that you can get to your Pearson e-text. And as we look to figure out how to do notes the best way, I think that it's going to make some sense to at least play around with using Screencastify to do some online notes. So this is my second take. We'll see if I do better this time than I did the first. When you click the Pearson e-text, you'll see that there's all kinds of different things here. You can see all the chapters there, and in particular, chapter 1 and part 1. So I'm going to click here and see what comes up. And notice that this is not a picture that you see in your textbook, but this part is. So this is on page 2 and 3. You see the picture of the globe. You see a little box that says upon completing this chapter, you will be able to do these various things. And then you can scroll to the next page. A second. There we are. And so this is actually the text from page 3 in your textbook. I have also given you in this Google post a worksheet that you can take notes on this worksheet if you like, if you think that's helpful. I have this in a key format, and I'm going to work off of my key as I give notes, but I think it would be important for you guys to take notes and actually write some things that you feel like are important down, and then if you ever want to compare after you've done your notes, then we can certainly work on that. Okay, so let's head back to the chapter. One of the things that I think is kind of interesting about this book is that you can, and I can, see if that'll do it. Yeah. If you highlight something, you can make it a main idea. You can put a question there. You can put observations, various things. And so one of the first things that I think you've got to understand about environmental science is that environment consists of everything that's living and everything that's non-living. So that would be all the things that are naturally living and non-living, and anything also that's been man-made. And so sometimes people think of the environment as just being the non-living things, but truly it also is about the living and really about how these things interact. So as we move on down here, notice that one of the next things that we've got to understand is the difference between environmental science, environmental studies, and environmentalism. And so environmental science is the scientific study of how the natural world works, how our environment affects us, and how we affect our environment. So in essence, environmental science examines the interactions between natural and human systems. So anything that interacts or exchanges energy and or materials. So that's really what that means. Environmental science also collects data on the human impact and effect of humans on the environment. And then finally, it studies sustainability. And what sustainability means, it looks for the stress in different environments and the degradation of those environmental systems to see how man is affecting the world around us. Generally, environmental science is free from any advocacy, free from politics. It really focuses on the science and the data and the experimental evidence, the empirical evidence to support the data. Environmental studies is broader than environmental science. It's more interdisciplinary. So it deals with things like policy making and laws, any laws that pertain to the environment and the protection of the environment. Generally, economics is a bigger factor when you're thinking about environmental studies. And then you can even include different literature or ethics when you're thinking about environmental studies. So environmental studies encompasses more than just the science. Environmentalism is a social movement with regard to the environment's protection. It is in general advocacy in nature, political by nature. There's lobbying, activism, education, all rolled up in environmentalism. You may or may not have heard of a fellow by the name of Barry Commoner. Barry Commoner wrote a book called The Closing Circle in the early 1970s, and he kind of laid out 4 what he called laws of ecology. And they are these. Number 1, everything is connected to everything else. Number 2, everything must go somewhere. Number 3, nature knows best. And number 4, there is no such thing as a free lunch. If you do a quick Google search on Barry Commoner, you'll see that he was one of the early advocates for environmentalism, but he was also a cellular biologist. And so he was not only a scientist, but also an environmentalist. Okay, so if we click a little bit further, let's keep going here. The next thing we really need to think about is we need to think about what renewable and non-renewable resources are. And to do that, we need to start with understanding what a natural resource is. So a natural resource are substances and energy sources that we take from our environment and that we rely on to survive. So I really like this chart, figure 1.1, and I think it's a good thing for you to fill out. There are 3 different types of resources, some that are renewable and we can't exhaust them, meaning we could use them and use them and use them and use them and they'd never go away. There are some that are renewable, but we can exhaust them. So if we don't use these resources sustainably, then we would exhaust the resources. And then there are non-renewable resources. So each of these 3 categories, you can see that solar, wind, wave, geothermal all go in the renewable and inexhaustible, and the freshwater, forest products, biodiversity go in renewable but exhaustible. And so like if we use too much water, the water cycle might not be able to replenish it and purify it as quickly as we might need it. If we cut too much timber, obviously, if we continue with clear cutting, we cut down all of our rainforests, they're not going to grow back more quickly than we can cut them down. While they do renew relatively quickly, we could, as humans, tear them all down before they'd have a chance to naturally rebuild, and so forth and so on. And then this non-renewable, I mean, if we use all the crude oil, we're finished with crude oil. If we extract all the natural gas, there's no more. If we use all the coal, there's no more. And the same is true with our minerals. Okay. The next thing the book talks about are these, this principle called ecosystem services. So our planet does a great job of trying to keep some of the resources that we need to survive replenished. And so whether we're purifying air or whether we're recycling nutrients, whether our weather patterns are regulated in part by the ecosystem, we pollinate plants, the way that we recycle waste through our soils and various things, the natural resources that we can get from timber or from food, the biodiversity on the earth. We use natural resources for recreation and even aesthetic beauty. And then the environment provides us some natural protection. So forest and a cliff that has a bunch of trees on it, or a hill that has a bunch of trees, is going to prevent erosion and prevent flooding more so than one that has been clear cut, and things of that nature. Okay, let's keep going. So the next big thing that we want to talk about are just general population growth over time. There are 2 main things that have really affected population since the 1800s. Number 1, the agricultural revolution, and number 2, the industrial revolution. I think that this right here, I put a little note and you can probably see it. What caused a lot of this change? A lot of it was agricultural industrial revolution, and our ability to grow more food, which was the agricultural revolution, and harness more energy, which pretty much is the industrial revolution. So to be, for most of the time that man has been on the planet, less than 1 million people, to 7 billion people in the course of 200 years is really exponential growth, which is what this particular graph and data set is showing you. And you can see got your agricultural revolution here and then industrial revolution. And in the middle of the early 1800s, and there we go. We're up to almost 8 billion people. All right. Let's see, and it talks to you some about both of those, so read through that. The next thing that's a really big deal in this chapter is understanding of ecological footprint. And we are going to do, you're doing the eco footprint activity. You'll have done that by the time you get to class tomorrow, and we'll go over that and look at some data associated with that. But I think it's going to be important for you to understand what overshoot is, and we'll talk about Earth Overshoot Day. This year it was July 29th. And we can talk more about that tomorrow. And then we need to critically think about our personal ecological footprint, the ecological footprint of our family, and the ecological footprint of the average American compared to citizens from other countries, and how that varies and how that how human impact does vary across the globe, and in many cases based on how many resources a country naturally has, but also the wealth of a nation. And so I think it makes sense for us to ask the question, can anything be done to change this? And I think environmental science in general is a mindset. It's kind of like, what can we do to do our part to live sustainably? Okay. Keep going. The next part of this chapter has to do with, to me, it goes more towards the first part of the chapter. There's a couple of things that talk about how environmental science is interdisciplinary. So there's a lot of different subjects that go along with environmental science. You can see them on the wheel here. And notice my comment. This goes with the first part of the chapter where we compare and contrast environmental science studies and environmentalism. If you're thinking about environmental studies, it's going to span the gamut of all of these things, from archaeology to anthropology, which is the study of human impact, to political science with laws, to history, looking at the agricultural industrial revolution. And then you've got some of your harder sciences, biology and chemistry, atmospheric science, geology, and so forth. So I think that goes pretty much with that. And then one of the final parts of the chapter is just describing the scientific method and the process of science. So this is pages 10 to 14. So it's a review of the scientific process, the understanding of correlation and causation and the difference between the two. So you need to review some of those things. And then there's a bunch of words in here that you should have certainly seen before. And there's even a case study on Easter Island. We'll probably talk about that some in class. But Easter Island is a classic case study on when resources are mismanaged, what may happen to a population of people living in a given area when natural resources become diminished and cannot be replenished. And I do think that, if you read through this particular case study, you'll see that there's a little bit of a debate. Was it the first people that moved on the island that mismanaged the resources, or was it outside influences like rats being introduced into Easter Island that ultimately caused disruption in the ecosystem that caused a trophic cascade? What was it that really happened? And so we can talk some through that in class as well. But I do think it's really important to come out of this chapter understanding what sustainability is. Okay, so sustainability just means how are we as a population of humans across the globe going to live in such a way that we can not max out our natural resources and survive and thrive for generations and generations to come. You see that you get Augusta, Georgia, gets a little shout out here. But I think this is an important point. Today, the 20 wealthiest nations boast more than 55 times per capita income of the 20 poorest nations, 3 times the gap that existed just 2 generations ago. Within the United States, the richest 10% of citizens now claim half of the total income and more than 70% of the total wealth. We'll watch a couple of videos that bring this point home, but I do think it's important to understand. Notice that I continue to highlight a few things that I think are main points. We're going to cover all this over the course of the year, and we're going to clip along at a pretty fast pace. Okay, there you are at the end of the chapter here. I hope that was helpful for you. I would love it if you guys would make sure your notes are filled out before tomorrow, and then also try your hand at answering some of these questions. I think it's good for you to practice your writing, and I'd like to see what some of your original answers are. Okay, I'll see you tomorrow in class.